Okay. So I was right. Okay.
That'd be good. I haven't read that one yet.
Unfounded Fears.
Unfounded Fears.
Okay.
From, what's it called again?
First you have to row a little boat.
Sounds like a good book.
And so he's talking about being a sailor and using the wind. And so that's what life gives you is wind. What you do with the wind is what you have to do to be a real sailor.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So
I've been on my little sailboat every once in a while, and sometimes it gets hard to row your boat.
yeah, it's pretty hard with the wind.
I remember the first time I encountered the Miss Ocean Beach, plowing through a bay, raising a wake higher than the highest waves on a stormy day. I was sitting under the boom, tiller over my shoulder, lost in thought, when suddenly there she was, dead ahead, on collision course, blaring her fearsome horn at me to get out of her way. The blast alone nearly pitched me overboard. I scrambled to my feet as the speedy, low-slung ferry swept past the starboard, with barely 100 feet to spare. She was riding her bow high and her stern low, cutting a broad swath in her passage, down the channel that ran between Fire Island and Bay Shore. She had been a rum runner during Prohibition days, and she still raced through the dredged waterways, as if she was laden with contraband and a Coast Guard cutter in pursuit. Only now, instead of legging liquor, she was carrying passengers who were milling about, gasping over the rails, amused, I imagined, by the near miss and waiting to see if I would survive the huge wake that was bearing down on me. Had I done nothing, the mountainous swells would have struck me in the worst way possible, broadside. Fortunately, I had sufficient presence of mind to turn my bow and hit them head on. The sail shook and the rigging rattled as my slope rode the roller coaster, diving down my first wave, plunging through the second and climbing the third. The boat emerged unscathed, but I was shaken to the core of my being, and for days afterward I heard the ferry's monster horn reverberating in my ears. I made a solemn vow. Never again would I let another boat get that close to my hull. I kept a sharp eye out, and as soon as I spotted a vessel, I would tack, jibe, and do whatever I had to do to make sure we didn't collide. The other boat might be no more than a pinpoint on the horizon. It didn't matter. I would start to maneuver, certain that if I didn't take preventative measures at once, we would both arrive at the same time, at the same place at the same time. And then one day, the inevitable occurred, something I would have foreseen, but didn't because my judgment was skewered by my fright. While sailing upwind, I glanced under the boom and saw a fishing trawler with a flying bridge going full throttle, apparently aiming straight for me, even though she was still a half-mile away. I veered off to make sure I would safely cross her stern, but at the same moment she also turned, and we were once more on what seemed like a collision course. I tacked, keeping her in view, and in that instant struck a huge floating log directly under my bow. The blue slope shuddered on impact, and I knew from the hard crunch that I had saved in the hull. I knelt on the floorboards and peered under the deck. Although it was too dark to see clearly, I could plainly hear the water sloshing through the gaping hole in my bilge. My boat came up into the wind, foundering. I quickly lowered my jib, and standing on the forward deck, I waved my arms frantically. The trawler, the very one I had been trying to avoid, was now within a few hundred yards, and the owner, seeing my distress, cut his engine and called, "Are you all right? I'm taking water." He brought his trawler as close to my boat as he could and threw me a line, which I secured around the base of the mast. A moment later, I was standing on the stern of the fishing boat, heading for shore with my sloop in tow. She was listing dangerously, but somehow managing to stay afloat. When we arrived at the shipyard, the workers promptly hauled her out, knocking the wooden plug out of her bottom and drained her dry. The captain, seeing my blue sloop up on the waves, rowed across the narrow creek between his home and the yard. He ran his hand over the splintered hull, rubbed his chin, and looked at me. What happened? I told him the truth, that I was so busy watching the fishing boat way off in the distance that I didn't see the floating log right under my bow. I thought he might lecture me, and then there was flotsam and jetsam, ? Shoals and flats, cans and nuns. All the dangers lurking in the water that can loom suddenly and wreck a ship. But instead he said, "Well, don't you worry none. Archie here, he's the best mechanic you ever saw. He'll fix up a plank and fit it in so it won't seem like anything happened at all." Archie was the ship's carpenter at the yard, but the captain always referred to him as the best mechanic you ever saw. And his faith in the man's skill wasn't misplaced. A week later, my boat was back in the water, with a new plank in her bow, and a fresh coat of blue paint, which I had applied myself on her hull. But even though the sloop was ready to go, the sailor was not. I stood on the shore, looking at my shop, thinking about all the terrible things that might happen to me, and for a while I wasn't sure if I wanted to leave the harbor. For the truth is that to sail, even to contemplate sailing, calls for fundamental faith in oneself. And at the moment I was aware of only the barriers between myself and my destination. A patch of sandy beach on the other side of the bay. First I would have to tack out of the shipyard's basin without crashing into the bulkhead, and then I would have to negotiate 8 miles of open water against buffeting winds and battering waves. Finally, I summoned up enough courage to board my boat, raised my sails, caught a puff, and began my zigzag course up the saltwater creek, making the best use of the fluky breeze that warped around the houses and sheds that lined the shore. When I reached the mouth of the creek, I trimmed my sheets. The boat heeled, and all at once I was free of land, pointing into the wind, aiming straight for the water tower, glistening in the sun above the beach of community of Saltaire. 2/3 of the way across, I saw a massive tanker barreling through the channel, heading for the oil terminal in Pachague, maybe. 20 miles away, she was riding low in the water, moving inexorably toward her destination, making it plain, her resolute passage, that she wasn't about to be deterred by any craft, small or large, that got in her way. Afraid I might run into her, I decided to head up to the wind, to come to a complete halt and wait for her to pass. But just as I was about to dump the wind out of my sails, I caught myself. Why do that? I thought. She's still a long way off. I continued to sail, and as I approached the tanker, it became obvious we wouldn't collide. She was going to cross my bow, leaving plenty of sea between us. I would still have to contend with her wake, but if I held my present course, with the wind full in my sails, the thrust of my sloop would carry me safely by. It happened exactly that way. The tanker and I missed each other by a wide margin, and as we went our separate ways, I realized I had been squandering a tremendous amount of energy fretting about a mental note of the vessel, to recognize she was out there somewhere. A potential hazard, but I also had to guard against reacting too soon, because the vision of disaster that rose so vividly in my mind might turn out to be nothing more than an unfounded fear. As I crossed the tanker's wake, my apprehensions began to fade. Although I didn't know it at the time, I was taking my first tentative steps toward becoming a master, not so much of my boat or of myself, but of reality. I was learning that before giving way to a seemingly threatening object, I had to stand close enough to it to find out what it was, where it was going, and if it would do me harm. Then, only then, could I decide to veer off, head up, or sail on. I was also acquiring a personal perspective about the world in which I dwelt. My guardian aunt liked to preach that everything happens for the best, a dictum in which she firmly believed, as if there were a hidden hand guiding human destiny. But I was discovering that as I sailed, that the universe was indifferent to my plight, and I couldn't predict before I left the safety of the harbor what obstacles I might encounter on the bay. I couldn't foresee when a would come out of nowhere and blare horn at me, or when my boat would ram my floating log randomly in the sea. Even those purportedly consistent elements of nature, wind, waves, and tides, seemed to defy the desperate forecast of man and take on the turbulence of their own. The distant shorelines with its coves and points appeared as irregular, as richly varied as the lobes of the maple leaf. The herring gulls drifting haphazardly across the summer sky settled like snowflakes on the beach. The grubs swimming off my bow arched their backs and dove without warning, popping up at random places on the surface, and suddenly diving again. If there was a pattern to all these indiscriminate movements, I couldn't detect it. I had to admit to myself that I had no idea what would happen next.
Liv, when you're reading to someone, every once in a while look at them. You know, like read your book and then check in with them to see if
these
he wants you to slow down, repeat,
Oh, well,
or
it's
he may
interesting
want to make a comment. You know,
because you don't know what he's talking about. You read it, but you don't understand the sailing terms. You know, like a jib or a tack and that kind of stuff. So,
are you're a sailor? Or
yeah, so I sail, and it's interesting to me, and I'm thinking, oh, because
she has the merit badges. She knows a little bit about it. I don't know how much you remember from the terminology when you took sailing.
I remember some of these words. Some of these words I just haven't been taught. Like I know starboard. I don't know what tacking is.
Tacking when you're going into the wind, and so you take an angle and you go back and forth. You zigzag because you can't go straight into the wind. But you can get it when it pushes against the keel. It'll push you forward if you're close to 45 degrees. So it's tacking. You can't go straight in the wind, but that's how you go upwind. Is tacking. Yeah.
I learned that with kayaking, but not sailboating.
So do you want some hot chocolate, or you want any decaf coffee or anything?
I'd take the hot
Sleepy
chocolate, but my
head.
mother would not let me.
Because of the sugar.
Sugar, yeah, I don't want a whole lot of sugar.
You want some unsweet tea?
No.
You want some decaf coffee?
No, I'll be okay.
Oh,
I don't like black coffee.
You know,
I'm very
that-
very picky. I'm a very picky
well, we could
person.
do some sweetener and some sugar.
Can't do either of those.
Neither of those. Unsweetened, okay.
No, it's
So-
okay.
Because
Thank you.
unsweetener is still a sweetener. The only sweetener she can have is maple syrup.
Oh, okay, I'm all out of it.
Like the real maple syrup.
No, but it's okay. Thank you for the
Okay,
offer.
sure. We'll keep reading. I'll just be wandering around the kitchen. You keep reading.
It was an unholy view, one that contradicted what I had been taught in Sunday school. Okay.
That's not real. That's the sugar stuff. Yeah, that's not real maple syrup. But thanks for trying. She'll be okay.
Okay.
It was an unholy view, one that contradicted what I had been taught in Sunday school. At first I was troubled by it. My religion teacher, a kindly woman who took special interest in me, claimed that there was a grand design to the universe, that an all-knowing deity ruled heaven and earth with a purpose in mind. I wanted to believe her. It was a comfort to think that what she said was true. But the more I sailed, the more convinced I became that she deluded herself. That life was a lot more confused and chaotic than she dared to admit. In science class, I was told the physical world was governed by immutable laws. My chemistry teacher described how electrons orbited the nucleus of an atom in the same predictable way the planets circled the sun. A stern disciplinarian who taught by rote, he believed that science could answer all the nagging questions of existence raised by man.
No, they can't. Absolutely not.
But with the passage of time, I discovered science had its shortcomings too.
Yep.
It could tell me how fluids behaved under pressure, or how air moved across the surface of a sail or wing, but it couldn't tell me where to go, or what to do, or how to get from where I was and where I wanted to be. And yet, if the universe was an uncertain place, I wasn't unduly perturbed.
Would your wife like to join us around the table? Or is she?
She's doing stuff.
Okay.
She's at church.
Okay.
I didn't demand a mechanistic view of the solar system to feel at home in my small corner of the globe. I sailed the Great South Bay, watching for a changing wind or flattening sea. I exercised my skills, taking pleasure in the unpredictable, erratic aspect of nature, feeling comfortable with myself because I had learned how to cope with surprise. Gradually, I came to understand that if there was an order to my life, it was one I imposed through what I practiced and what I perceived. As I grew older and more experienced, I realized that the ability to distinguish the real and apparent dangers is fundamental to good judgment, and people who don't possess it are seriously handicapped. They dwell in a state of...
Will you read that sentence again?
That's for your benefit.
Yeah, or mine.
As I read, I don't know why, I'm increasingly busy. It's strange. As I grew older and more experienced, I realized that the ability to distinguish between real and apparent dangers is fundamental to good judgment, and people who don't possess it are seriously handicapped. They dwell in a state of incipient and catastrophe. Incipient catastrophe, thinking only of what can go wrong and trying to ward it off before it occurs. That's so true. They aren't masters of reality, although they like to think they are. They're masters of unreality because they let their fears, which are figments of untrustworthy imagination, govern their lives. That's what overthinking does to you. I can tell you right now, sometimes you spend too much time overthinking the future that it becomes so unrealistic. Like my mom, she's like, "Can you go into the store and get this for me?" And I'll be like, "Yeah, sure." And I'll see like 8 guys walk past me, and I'm already ready with like 18 different like kung pao moves to kick them when the sun don't shine because I think they're about to kidnap me. And then they don't, and I'm like, okay.
Yeah, well, there might be. There's some situational awareness that needs to be there. So that's the difference. Looking at it realistically or not. That's what he's talking about. Some of it's overreacting and some of it's underreacting because
Right.
you don't plan, and fools rush in where angels fear to tread, and then you got the other one. The other one says, "Well, I can't do anything. There's a lion in the streets. I can't do it." So, yeah.
It's as if they never break through a secret barrier that separates the timber. It's like my 4th yawn. So annoying. Timorous from the self-assured. What does that mean? What's timorous?
Timid.
Timid?
Timorous.
From like
Timid.
the shy to the brave?
Shy.
Okay. I know a brilliant attorney who plans family outings with the same diligence he tries cases in a court of law. To the concertation of his wife and children, he insists on preparing for every possible contingency, every imaginable disaster. Before they leave, life for him is a trial, a real trial, and he is in a constant adversarial relationship with it, trying to beat it at its own game. In so doing, he misses out on the simple, unexpected pleasures of the moment at hand. I can guarantee you right now that an attorney is probably a prosecution attorney. Prosecutioners, because I'm also in law class and I enjoy it. I really like being on the prosecution side. But the case that we're doing right now, there's a character named Remington, and I really want to be, and he's on defense, so I might switch to defense this time. But I just think, anyway, prosecution attorneys, I can tell you, are a lot more aggressive than defense attorneys. Defense attorneys have to be aggressive, but they're more on the, because prosecution has to be like, as you can see, it's this, this, and this. That is exactly what happened, and there's no other way around it. Then defense is like, well, why don't you consider this and this to happen,